Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel, and Mirtz Hashem today we will be learning Daf Kuf Nun Aleph Amid Aleph. Our learning today should be Oschus for Achenu Kabeis Yisrael Hanesunim Batzaru Bashivya Ha'imdim Bein Bayam Ubein Bayabasha Hamakim Yerachem Aleihem V'Yitziei Mitzar L'Rvacha Me'afela La'ira Mishibur L'Geula Hashta Bagalo of Isman Kariv and Emar Amen. Our learning should be Oschus Refuah Shalema for Yeshua Levi ben Ahuva Malkachana, Moshe ben Esther Fradl, Yitzchak ben Tzion, ben Dusha, Rivka bas Shiraleah, and Chava Hadassah bas Serel. They should have a Refuah Shalema B'Seich Shar Chole Yisrael. Our learning should also be a schus, the limud Torah of Gans Klal Yisrael should stand as a schus for Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shalom should watch over Gans Klal Yisrael B'chol Makom Shehem. Okay, so we pick up today on Kuf Nun Amid Beis, the bottom line in the Shulchan Aruch, with the words of the Ramah Hagah. Now, in Siman, in Sif Tes Vav, Sif Tes Zayin, really a little bit before that, Sif Yud Dalet, we've been discussing various scenarios where you're creating a belila. You're doing the malacha, or you're doing something that may be considered the malacha of lush, of kneading together and creating a mixture, taking dry ingredients and mixing them and combining them through the addition of a liquid agent. And we've seen cases where that does become a problem of lush, other cases where it's not considered a problem of lush. In Sif, between Sif Tes Vav and Sif Tes Zayin, the Mechaber really gave us three different shittas over here when it comes to these halachas. What's important for us to know right now is that near the end of Sif Tes Zayin, and near the ends of the words of the Mechaber in Sif Tes Zayin, 3 lines off the bottom of Kuf Nun Amid Beis, the Mechaber gave us really over here his third shita. And in this shita of the Mechaber really told us that according to this shita, it's never mutter to add a liquid agent to dry ingredients on Shabbos if no liquid was added to that mixture before Shabbos. Now, the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Cotton Samech Dalid explained that the rationale for this shita is paskening like Rebbe. This shita is paskening that as soon as you add a liquid agent to dry ingredients, and when I say dry ingredients, I mean finely chopped up dry ingredients, where it is shayich to be megabel, where you could actually create a kneaded mixture. As soon as you introduce the liquid, that already is the Isser of lush. Therefore, if you do the math, explains the Mishnah Berurah, according to this third shita of the Mechabers, you have the dry ingredients on Shabbos, no liquid was added on Erev Shabbos. Now, to go ahead and add liquid, it's not going to help you if you do any kind of shinui after you add the ingredients and you mix it, let's say, biyad instead of a keli, or instead of beating it, you mix it gently. It's not going to help, because as soon as you introduce the liquid, you're already over on the malach of lush. So this Yesh Omrim says, if you didn't add liquid to the dry ingredient already before Shabbos, this Yesh Omrim says, on Shabbos, there's no way to go ahead and add anything, because no matter what you do, it's not going to help. Now, the Mishnah Berurah, yeah. Okay. Now, what the Mishnah Berurah tells us in Ois Cotton Samech Vav is that this Mechaber seems to be talking about a blila ava. He's talking about a case where you're going to create a blila ava, a thick mixture, like a dough. But how about when it comes to a blila raka? So when it comes to a blila raka, now we're going to turn to the words of the Ramah, where the Mishnah Berurah says that this Ramah is addressing the question of creating a blila raka on Shabbos, when the liquid agent was not added to the dry ingredients before Shabbos. Says the Ramah Hagah, if you add the dry ingredient into the bowl first, and and you then introduce the liquid ingredient like vinegar or wine, me'arvai be'etzbai, and you don't mix it with a keli. You mix it with your hand. You mix it with your finger. Shari, then it becomes mutter. Dehevi shinoi kemai b'shatisa de la'el. Because now you're employing a shinoi, and this is similar to what we learned in Sif Yodalit when we spoke about the shatisa. The shatisa was the flour that's made out of immature grain. It's toasted immature grain. It's coarse ground into flour. And over there, we said that you're allowed to make a blila raka out of it. But you also have to switch around what you add first. Whatever the derech is, if it's the derech to add the dry ingredient first, you have to add the liquid ingredient first. If it's the derech to add the liquid ingredient first, you have to add the dry ingredient. So the Ramah says that over here, you want to make a blila raka. Says the Ramah, you could make a blila raka if you make one shinui, which is by flipping the order in which you add the ingredients, and you also have to make another shinui in the way you mix it. Don't mix it with a keli, mix it with your finger. Continues the Ramah, the top line of Kuf Nun Aleph Amud Aleph, v'chein nayagin lahater al yedei shinui, and the Ramah says, indeed, this is the minig that you're allowed to create such a blila raka with these shinuyim. And now the Ramah makes the point that I just mentioned. When it comes to the shinui of which ingredient you should add first, that is going to be completely dependent upon what the derech is. If the derech is that you add the dry ingredient and then the liquid ingredient, so then then add the liquid ingredient first, and then add the dry ingredient. Okay. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Cotton Samach Zayin on Kuf Nun Aleph Amud Aleph. V'chein noegin. Hainu b'chardel v'shum. This v'chein noegin is going to apply to the case of Sif Tezvav when we spoke about the ground mustard seed. V'shum, it's going to also apply to Sif Tezvav, to Sif Tezayin, this Sif, where we spoke about chopped up garlic. V'huadin b'shar minei tibul kisha oisan dak dak, uma'arvin oisan biyachad. This is also going to refer to other kinds of mixtures where you create a blila raka using finely cut up, finely ground up dry ingredients. That's dak dak. And now you're introducing a liquid agent. The Ramah is telling you over here, you're allowed to do this on Shabbos, even though no liquid was added to this mixture before Shabbos. You're allowed to introduce liquid into this mixture. You have to A, make one shinui in what you add first. Whatever you do during the week, you have to do it the opposite way, and you have to do it be'etzba. You cannot do it with a keli. The Ramah said that it all depends on what the usual derech is to do during the week. Whatever the derech is to do during the week, you have to flip it around and do it the opposite way on Shabbos. Says the Mishnah Berurah, therefore, let's take a look at a practical case. Im shachach lishpoich chaymitz be'erev Shabbos l'soich hachrein. If you forgot to put vinegar into the chrein before Shabbos. So they didn't have the luxury, apparently, of going to the grocery store and buying a jar of prepared chrein. They would make the chrein in their kitchen. So you have a bowl of finely ground horseradish. So here is your dry ingredient. You have finely ground horseradish. That is something which, if you introduce a liquid ingredient to it, you're going to come up with a shaila of being megabel. You're going to come up against a shaila of lush. So here's a very good practical case. What do you do over here? Says the Mishnah Berurah, okay, you didn't mix it before Shabbos. There's no liquid ingredient introduced into the ground horseradish before Shabbos. Vos tutman. Says the Mishnah Berurah, tzarich sheyase b'Shabbos blila raka. First of all, you have to make a blila raka. Because generally speaking, you see right away from this Ramah and from this Mishnah Berurah, you see that we expect the halacha to follow the third shita of the Mechaber, the Yesh Omrim that I opened up to share with, which says that to make a blila ava on Shabbos, You can't make a blila ava on Shabbos when no liquid was introduced into the mixture before Shabbos. There's no heter to make a blila ava on Shabbos. That was the mechaber. V'yesh oimrim, there's a yesh oimrim that says, Tahad deshari la'arev mashka bechardel. This idea that you could make a blila ava, because the Mishnah Berurah says this is talking about a blila ava, that there's a possible heter to go ahead and mix a blila ava out of the mustard on Shabbos was dafke shenesanei b'ba'ayom, was only negeya if the liquid was introduced b'ba'ayom. But if the liquid was not introduced before Shabbos, there's no heter. There's no possible heter to make a blila ava. So now let's go back to our Mishnah Berurah here. Mishnah Berurah is cutting samaches. Against that backdrop, against the expectation that we paskin like that yesh oimrim of the mechabers, so now says the Mishnah Berurah, you have your dry ground horseradish, you want to introduce your liquid chrein to do a blila ava, you can't do. That you can't do. We paskin like the yesh oimrim. So you can't make a blila ava. But what can you do? You can make a blila raka, like the Haggah that we just learned, like this Ramah. You can make a blila raka, but even when you make a blila raka, you have to do it according to the rules that the Ramah just outlined. So let's take a look at what the Mishnah Berurah says. You neglected to add the liquid agent, the vinegar, into the ground horseradish before Shabbos. First of all, you must mix it into a blila raka. It can't be a blila ava. And you have to switch the order in which you typically add the ingredients. First put the vinegar into the bowl, the liquid agent, and then add the solids, then add the ground up horseradish. Why? Because the derech during the week was to do it the other way. The derech during the week was to have the ground horseradish in the bowl and then introduce the liquid vinegar. So you need to switch it. Shaloi kederech, shoysin b'choil. You have to do it in an opposite way that it's done during the week. And now you also have to make a shinui in how you're going to mix it. Can you mix it with a spoon? No. The yechois b'kli atzmai. Either take the bowl via nanea oisai and shake the bowl, or, even though the Mishnah Berurah doesn't say this, but the Ramah said, mix it with your finger. That would be a shinui also in how you mix it. You're mixing it with your finger. Continues the Mishnah Berurah. Ubi yerek hanikra salatin. However, when it comes to something like lettuce, then the Mishnah Berurah says, ein lo daktik b'chol zeh. You don't have to be concerned with this when it comes to something like chopped up lettuce. Because that's not something that you grind up fine, which could actually end up being an issue of lush. When you cut up lettuce, it's large pieces. That's not going to form any kind of unified mixture when you add a liquid agent. Aval, however, but if you take radishes, that's snoin. If you take radishes and you take cucumbers and you cut them up you cut them up very, very fine, and you pour in vinegar, or some other liquid into them, and you mix it together. So now, scenario, you're taking cucumber, and it sounds like you're chopping up the cucumber very, very fine. Or you're taking radish, and you're chopping up the radish very, very fine. Now, I'm harping on the fact that the Mishnah Berurah is talking about a case where you cut it very, very fine. Because if you take a look at Sharat Tzion, Ois Katan Pei Dalid, the first three words of that Sharat Tzion are Va'aftuhu Ava. Even though over here you're going to be creating a Belila Ava. Now, it's very interesting the way the Chavetz Chaim chose to write this. And again, it might be because this was a very common Michael in his time, and it's not a very common Michael in our time. I don't recognize a salad where we have a Belila Ava made out of chopped up cucumber. But it's very clear that that's what the Mishnah Berurah is talking about. And now the math of this case becomes very, very interesting. Because remember what I just told you a minute ago. It's very clear from the Mishnah Berurah that we are in general, high level, we're posketing like the third sheet of the Mechaber, which says that you really cannot make a Blila Ava on Shabbos, unless liquid was introduced on Erev Shabbos. But if no liquid was introduced on Erev Shabbos, there's no heter to create a Blila Ava on Shabbos. And yet, over here, the Mishnah Berurah is going to tell us that we can make a bli la'ava out of this very interesting cucumber or radish salad of very finely chopped up cucumbers or radishes and vinegar. So what's the math on that? How does that become mutter? So let's see what the Mishnah Berurah says, and then maybe we'll read the Sharetzian inside. The Mishnah Berurah says, this, that the minig is to chop up radish or cucumbers very, very fine into tiny pieces, and then pour vinegar or another liquid into them, and you mix it together, which creates a bli la'ava. How could you do that? Says the Mishnah Berurah, you have to be very careful. You cannot do this with a keli. You can't do it with a spoon. That's a kaf. And you can't do it b'koyach. You can't do it strenuously. You can't beat it or whip it. Or yenanea b'kli atzmai. Or if you're not going to do it with your, let's say, with your hand, because he says you have to do it not with a spoon, so I guess with your hand, or yenanea b'kli atzmai, or shake the bowl and mix it that way. So what exactly did the Mishnah Berurah just say? This Mishnah Berurah does not follow from the Ramah, because the Ramah that we're learning now is talking about a bli l'raka. This is talking about a bli la'ava. He's telling me you can make a bli la'ava. How do you make a bli la'ava? Well, mix it gently. Don't mix it b'koyach, right? Shaloy la'arev b'kafu b'koyach. Don't use a keli. Don't do it b'koyach. So either use your hand and do it gently, or shake the bowl, and then you're allowed to do it. How is this mutter? Explains the Sharetzian a nice cut and pay dollar. Va'aftehu ava, even though over here we're talking about creating a bli la'ava, uba ava machber hayesh oimrim mipnei nesinas hamashke, and we're poskening like the yesh oimrim, like the third shita that we started the shir off with today, which says that you're never allowed to create a bli la'ava, because the second you introduce the liquid, you're already being over on the isser of lush. Kasavataz, the Taz writes, when it comes to this particular kind of salad that's made with radish or with ugakus, with cucumbers, she'i efshar lasois me erev Shabbos. For some reason, this is something that cannot be prepared on erev Shabbos. I don't know why. Maybe it has something to do with the strength of the vinegar. Maybe the vinegar does something to the cucumbers or to the radish, and if you prepare it on erev Shabbos, it simply won't taste good on Shabbos. So apparently, this was a dish that cannot be prepared on erev Shabbos. And since it can't be prepared on erev Shabbos, we're going to be makel, and we're going to allow you to step away from the third shita of the mechaber, and we're going to paskin more like the second shita of the mechaber, who holds like Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda that introducing the liquid is not an isser of lush, and holds that as long as you don't do the mixing with a keli and you don't do it b'koyach, you don't beat it or whip it, it's mutter. That's what the Sharetzian writes over here. Samchirin adeh kamaisa. The loyamrina nesidas hamashke zeu gibuloi. We're going to rely on the shita of Rabbi Yossi of adeh kamaisa. Well, I guess by adeh kamaisa he means the first opinion of the mechaber that paskins like Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda that the introduction of the liquid is not lush. Of tiku gamkein el yaraba ladina. And finally, the Mishnah Berurah ends off by cutting samaches for toiv lahachmer gamkein. We should also be machmer sheyiten achometz v'achakach hamaychel. We still should apply the shinui of the Ramaz, which is really talking about a bli l'raka, but we should employ that shinui as well, and we should make sure to reverse the order in which the ingredients are typically mixed. Okay, another practical application of these halachas, says the Mishnah Berurah. Okay, shakal Pesach b'Shabbos. When Pesach falls out on Shabbos. So let's say the first Seder is Friday night. V'shakach mi ba'od yom litein amashke l'sayich hacharoises. You neglected to add the liquid ingredients into your charoises. So you have a keli of ground nuts, ground dates, ground apples, ground pears, but you don't have a liquid ingredient. You don't have a liquid agent. You have some cinnamon in there, but you didn't add in your wine. So you don't have a liquid ingredient. You have a dry bowl of dry ground up ingredients. What do? Says the Mishnah Berurah, L'dei kamaisa, according to the first opinion, mutter liten mashke b'Shabbos, you would be allowed to add the mashke. You'd be allowed to add the liquid to the dry ingredients on Shabbos, because that would be the shita of Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. I'm getting the shitas right? I believe I am. Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda is the Mekel, right? I just want to check. Yeah, Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda is the Mekel. So L'dei Kamaisa, again, I keep tripping up on this. L'dei Kamaisa is a reference to the Mechaber's first opinion. According to the Mechaber's first opinion, that paskins, like Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, that adding the liquid ingredient is not a problem of lush, so you could pour the liquid ingredient into the charoisis, so far you're okay. Mutter liten amashke b'Shabbos, then how are you going to mix it? The answer is, lo yitroif bekaf, don't beat it and whisk it. That's the typical way to do it. Ela be'etzpa, go mix it, lo yitroif bekaf, ela be'etzpa, mix it gently with your finger. So you're following the first opinion of the Mechaber. It's really not, I don't know why he says, well, it's the first opinion of the Mechaber with the caveat of the Ramah, 3 lines down on Kuf Nun Amud Beis, the lo ya'ariv bekaf ela b'yad, that you don't use a keli, you use your hand. But uladasa yesh oimrim gam ze aser. But according to the Mechaber's third opinion here, this would be also because you can't add the liquid to the dry ingredient. Unless you do like the Ramah, and you turn your charoisis not into a blilava, you turn your charoisis into a blilaraka. Next halacha, says the Mishnah Berurah. Also, litraif beitzim b'ka'ara, you're not allowed to beat eggs on Shabbos. You're not allowed to crack open eggs and beat eggs on Shabbos. Why? Not a problem of gibel. This is not lush. What is it? Marasayan. Because it's Marasayan. Shenira kimisha writes lavashlo b'gdera. It looks like you're setting about to make scrambled eggs on Shabbos. Not allowed to make scrambled eggs on Shabbos. So what are you doing in the kitchen? Beating eggs in a bowl. It looks like you're making scrambled eggs. So that's also. However, how about just making use of beaten eggs on Shabbos? How are you going to make use of beaten eggs? Says the Mishnah Berurah, Shabbos, if the eggs were already beaten on Erev Shabbos, Efshir the Yesh Lahakal, is possible that we could be makel to allow litnam l'saych borscht bekli sheni legavein. You have hot borscht in a kli sheni. So it's not in the kli rishon that it was cooked in, it's in a kli sheni. So remember the rules of bishul, high level, kli sheni is not mevashel. So you have raw beaten eggs, you have hot borscht in a kli sheni. Says the Mishnah Berurah, it's possible that we could be makel to go ahead and take the eggs and pour them into a hot kli sheni legavein. This was done mainly in order to color the borscht. It's funny because this takes me back to my childhood. I remember my mother doing this on Pesach. I remember my mother having a thing of hot borscht and taking eggs and beating the eggs into the hot borscht, and it would turn the borscht from a deep purple into a soft pink. And says the Mishnah Berurah, it's possible that we could be matir doing that on Shabbos. Now, this is actually quite interesting, because if you're chazering the halachas of bishul, you'll remember that the Mishnah Berurah stated very, very clearly that you're not allowed to add foods into a kli sheni. We don't know what's considered kali bishul, etc., etc. So really, the Mishnah Berurah was machmir and said that you never should add raw foods into a kli sheni. Maybe that's why it says over here, efsher the yesh lahakol. Okay. If this borscht was very strong, if it's very, I guess the word would be pungent, if it's very vinegary and strong, yesh lahakmer gam bazeh mishum bishul, because this could have, I guess, like a pickling effect, which already kavush kimavushal, just by pickling these eggs in the very vinegary, strong, pungent borscht, that could be a problem as well. Okay, that really kind of concludes the, I guess I would say, more complex than expected topic of lush and being megabel. Teuchen, grinding, was also quite complex on Shabbos. Now we're going to move along. Again, some preparations that we're not really familiar with. Says the Mechaber Sif Yud Zayin, second line down. Motor lases yeinoimlin. You're allowed to make yeinoimlin. This is actually something that's mentioned in the Mishnah. This is on Kuf Lam and Tes Amud Beis in Masechta Shabbos Beferish in the Mishnah. The Mishnah does not call it yeinoimlin with yuds, with yudin. It calls it einomlin with an aleph. But it's the same thing. Mutar lases yeinoimlin. You're allowed to make this preparation called yeinoimlin on Shabbos. What is yeinoimlin? Shehu yayin yoshan. This is aged wine, dvash mixed with honey, upalpalin, and pepper. Why? Why are you allowed to produce this? Well, why would you not be allowed to produce it? Well, I think really the Mechaber is saying this as a contrast to the next halacha. But right now he says you're allowed to make the yeinoimlin mipnei shehu l'shtia, because this is a preparation that is made as a drink, and you're allowed to make a drink on Shabbos. Now let's read weiter. But, says the Mechaber, ve'ein oisen aluntis. However, you are not allowed to mix up the preparation called aluntis. What's aluntis? Shu yain yoshan, again, aged wine. Umayim tzelulim, very clear water, very clear, clean water. V'shemen afarsamoin, and balsam oil. Shehu l'refuah. That you're not allowed to make on Shabbos. Why? Because that was a medicinal concoction. And you're not allowed to mix up something for refuah on Shabbos. And that's because of the gzeira, mishum shchikas samamonim. We don't allow you, there's a gzeira, an isur d'Rabbanan, to make or do things that are for refuah. Of course, sakana is a different story. But, high level, to do things that are for refuah, to make preparations that are for refuah, is an isur d'Rabbanan on Shabbos. Gzeira mishum shchikas samamonim. Back then, every household was its own pharmacy. When it was time, when they needed a medicine, they had herbs and spices. They knew what to mix up. They would grind and grate ingredients, and they would mix up a potion, and they would make a medicine. And the grinding is something which is also on Shabbos. So anything that is related to refuah, the Chachamim, high level, asered on Shabbos, as a gzeira that you might come to an isur d'oraisa of shchikas samamonim. So to mix up the aluntis, you can't do. So the two halachas that the Mechaber tells me is two different types of drinks. Yeinoimlin, you're allowed to produce. You're allowed to make it on Shabbos. Why? Because it's for shtia. It's making a nice iced tea. It's making a nice refreshing drink. You're allowed to make drinks on Shabbos. No problem. Make yeinoimlin. Aluntis, which is another drink, you can't prepare on Shabbos. Why? Because that was done for refuah. Refuah, it's also b'shum gzeira, shchikas samamonim. Says the Mishnah Berurah cut in Samach Tes. Yeinoimlin. You're allowed to make yeinoimlin. Now the Mishnah Berurah qualifies this a little bit. Says the Mishnah Berurah, what does this mean? You're allowed to make yeinoimlin. Hainu la'arvan, you could mix it up. Ula'achlan, and you could eat it. Kemoishehain, the way it is. Aval, however, also litroi faisan yafeh ulisananon. Apparently, the way this yeinoimlin was made, it wasn't just a question of add a little bit of this, add a little bit of that into your cup, stir it up and drink it. This was really a concoction that was a process. It is something that was, it took a skill and it took work to produce it in the right way. And it had to be beat and it had to be filtered and strained. It was a production to properly make yeinoimlin. Says the Mishnah Berurah, not so pashut that you could just go ahead and make yeinoimlin in the typical way. Says the Mishnah Berurah, what the Mechaber, when the Mechaber says you could make yeinoimlin, and he's pulling it from a Mishnah in Masechta Shabbos, and you take a look at the Gemara in the Rishonim, hainu la'arvan ula'achlan kemoishehain. You could take these ingredients, you could take aged wine, and you could take honey, and you could take pepper. You could add them into a cup, and you could go ahead and you could drink it. But you can't beat it, and you can't strain it. And it seems that the reason is, I think I'm looking at this right, is because, well, let's read the Mishnah Berurah weiter. Aval also litrei faisan yafe. You can't beat it together well the way it's typically done. Ulasananon, and you can't go ahead and filter it. Shezeh toirech yoiser, because this is a terchi yisera. This is not appropriate for Shabbos. V'umnis gedoyla. It takes skill to properly make yain oimlin. V'tikun gadol huzeh. It's a serious preparation. So it sounds to me like what the Mishnah Berurah is talking about over here is terchi yisera, uvdin d'chayil. So there are reasons why to properly make yain oimlin on Shabbos, not so pashut. But you want to take some aged wine, some honey, some pepper, put it into a cup and drink it, das ken mitan. That's mutter. He also says that you would come up against, to a certain extent, an issue of lush somehow, that this is something that you can't be toirif. It's something that you can't beat. You can only mix. Kos of Maril. The Maril writes, also lasis kida l'sei chaimetz lasis tibel. You're not allowed to add kida into vinegar to create a dip. Kida, the way Art Scroll defines it, the translation that I've seen for kida, generally speaking, is cassia, which is very, very similar to cinnamon. It even has, from what I understand, a similar taste to cinnamon. I even think that, reading between the lines, sometimes when you buy cinnamon, it might actually either be cassia or it might have cassia mixed into it, unbeknownst to us. And sticks of cassia look suspiciously like sticks of cinnamon. Cinnamon is sweeter, the cassia is more pungent, it's stronger. But apparently, they would take this kida and they would add it to vinegar and they would make a dip. And says to Maril, you're not allowed to do this on Shabbos. V'chein similarly, lases beitzim koshim im pitrezlin b'chaimitz aser. You're not allowed to make a dip out of ground up parsley and vinegar, which they used to use to dip hard-boiled eggs in. It seems that this does not mean that you're not allowed to mix eggs with petrezlin b'chaimitz. If I'm understanding this properly, I think the Mishnah Berurah is saying you're not allowed to make the petrezlin and chaimitz dip, which is generally used to dip hard-boiled eggs into. And why aren't you allowed to make this? The dami lehilmi. This is not a lush issue. This is not a gibel issue. This seems to be an issue. Read the Mishnah Berurah in the brackets. Hume melach hamavur le'el b'sif beis. This takes us back all the way to Sif Beis in this Siman, where the Mechaber told us a halacha that you're not allowed to prepare a large quantity of salt water on Shabbos. Why? Because it looks like you're embarking on a pickling project. It seems that what the Mishnah Berurah is bringing down from the Maril over here is that these two things, preparing this kida and chaimitz dip, preparing the petrezlin b'chaimitz dip, are both similar to hilmi. It's both similar to preparing the strong salt water mixture on Erev Shabbos, which is a problem. But this would only be aser, even not according to the Magen Avram. Even if you want to be machmer like the Maharil, this would only be aser the way it was aser in Sif Beis, which is to create a large amount of it. But even the Maharil would be matir going ahead and preparing a small amount of this to use as a dip on the table. The chamavur la'el b'Sif Beis. Ois cotton ayin, you're not allowed to make the aluntis shehu l'refuah, because that's a mixture that was made for refuah. V'chol davar shehu mishum refuah, anything that you're doing for refuah purposes, asru chazal lasais, that's an issa d'rabbanan to do on Shabbos, gzeira mishum shchika samemonim. V'lochein afilo ya'asimi erev Shabbos also l'shtoisai, and therefore, even if you have aluntis that was mixed up from before Shabbos, you're not allowed to go ahead and drink it on Shabbos, because that would be refuah on Shabbos, and you're not allowed to do that. Now, we're not going to discuss all the halachas of refuah right now, what medicines you're allowed to take, what medicines you're not allowed to take. That's going to be a discussion for later on in Chelik Gimel. We should all get there in good health. Bezos Hashem Yisparach. Turning to Sif Yud Ches. 4 lines down. Says the Mechaber, Ein shoyren es hachiltis. You're not allowed to soak chiltis. What is chiltis? So chiltis seems to be translated as asafetida. Asafetida. What is asafetida? Boy, that helped a lot, everybody, right? Oh, asafetida. What's asafetida? So looking into it, what asafetida is, it's a resin which apparently is produced from the roots of certain plants, certain trees, certain plants. Resin is like a sap that is exuded by these roots, and that is the main ingredient of this asafetida. That's what chiltis is. So ain't shoyrin as a chiltis. You're not allowed to soak this resin. You're not allowed to soak the chiltis. Loi b'feishrin v'loi b'tzaininin. Not in warm water, not in cold water. Now, what's going on over here? So again, we're talking about producing something that was normally produced for refuah purposes. There was medicinal value to taking this asafetida and soaking it in warm water and partaking of it, of this mixture, when it's warm. So says the Mechaber, you're not allowed to prepare this on Shabbos. Ein shoyrin as a chiltis, loy b'feishrin v'loy b'tzaininin, shederech l'shroisei l'refuah, because this is something that's generally done for refuah, and therefore to do it on Shabbos is also midrabanan gzerim mishum shchikas samamonim. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah's cut 9 aleph. L'shroisei l'refuah, the derech is to go ahead and prepare this for refuah purposes. You soak it for refuah. Sheshoisin me'ashriya, because they would drink the water, the warm water that the chiltis was soaked in. They would go ahead and they would drink that as a medicine on Shabbos, liyukra doliba, for the heaviness of the heart. Not sure what that means. Okay, now the Mechaber says, last word, 4 lines down, aval. What you could do is, you could take some of this chiltis, you could put it into vinegar on Shabbos, umitabel by pitoi. So you can't go ahead and prepare the chiltis medicine on Shabbos. So you can't take chiltis, soak it in warm water, cold water, let it soak, and then drink the chiltis water. That you can't do because that's clearly for refuah. But what you can do is, you can make a chiltis dip. You could take some chiltis, put it into vinegar, and have a dip, and dip your bread into it. That you could do. If you take a look at the Biur Halacha, Dibra Maschel Pitoi, the Chavetz Chaim says the reason this is okay is ve'ein kan heker shehu l'refuah, because now it doesn't look like what you're doing is for refuah purposes. Shekol hashana adam noyeg betibel, because this was a dip that was typically used, right? This was a dip that people had on their Shabbos table. They had chiltis dip, so you can't go produce chiltis medication. But you want to make chiltis dip and put it out to dip your bread, your challah into? That you're allowed to do. And says the Biur Halacha, mashma mizeh, tafiluhu miskaven l'refuah gam ken shari. Biur Halacha says it would seem to him that from the words of the Mechaber, it's mashma, that even if you're doing some kind of a harama over here, really you need a dose of chiltis because you're suffering from yukra deliba. But you remember that you're not allowed to make chiltis on Shabbos. Oh, you'll make chiltis dip, you'll eat your chiltis dip, and that'll help you for the yukra deliba instead of the chiltis medication. Continues the Mechaber, Hayo sharui me esmo. Let's say you prepared your chiltis dip, your chiltis medication. You soaked your chiltis me esmo on Erev Shabbos. You know you're not allowed to create it on Shabbos. So you soaked it on Erev Shabbos. Now the question is, are you allowed to take the medicine? Are you allowed to partake of the chiltis medication on Shabbos? We said until now, you're not allowed to prepare it on Shabbos. All right, I didn't prepare it on Shabbos. I prepared it on Shabbos. Am I allowed to take a dose of the medication on Shabbos? And now we're going to see a halacha that's very often negeh, very much lamaisa. Says the Mechaber, hayasharoi me'esmoil. If you soaked your chiltis and you created your chiltis medication before Shabbos, mutter, and the Mishnah Berurah says that the next word should not be lishroisai. It's mutter to soak it. It should be mutter lishtoisai. You're allowed to drink it. So how you sharu me'esmail, if you prepared your chiltis medication, you soaked it, me'esmail from Erev Shabbos, mutter lishtoisai b'Shabbos. You're allowed to go take a dose of the medicine on Shabbos. Why? Refuah, shrika samamonim. Hold your horses, we're going to see at the end of the sif. Continues the Mechaber, v'im shasa mimenu, yom chamishi, v'yom shishi. Now, apparently this chiltis medication was something that was taken 3 days in a row. So, nowadays, somebody has strep throat, goes to the doctor gives you a bottle of antibiotics, and he tells you, take it for 10 days. And on the bottle it says, be sure to take this medication exactly as directed, do not skip a dose, and be sure to take it for a full 10 days. That's this chiltis. Chiltis was taken, the prescription was, take chiltis for 3 days and do not skip a dose. So, what happens? V'im shasa mimenu yom chamishi. Let's say you took a dose on Thursday. V'yom shishi. And you took a dose on Erev Shabbos. V'tzarich lishtois gam b'Shabbos. And you need to take a dose on Shabbos. But you don't have any. So, in other words, the Mechaber opened up the sif saying you're not allowed to make chiltis medication on Shabbos. Are you allowed to take chiltis on Shabbos if it was already prepared before Shabbos? The Mechaber said, yes, you can. You could take it on Shabbos. Now the Mechaber is addressing another shaila. What if you took chiltis on Thursday, you took chiltis on Friday, you must take chiltis on Shabbos, but you don't have any, because you forgot to make it on Erev Shabbos. Says the Mechaber, mutter, you're allowed what? What's mutter? You're allowed to make chiltis on Shabbos. Okay? So, you're not allowed to prepare chiltis on Shabbos. High level, you're not allowed to prepare chiltis on Shabbos. If you prepared chiltis before Shabbos, you're allowed to take it on Shabbos. Why? Because it's sakana if you don't. That's what's going to come out at the end. If you took chiltis on Thursday and on Friday, and you must take chiltis on Shabbos, because if you don't, it's sakana, but you forgot to prepare it on Erev Shabbos, mutter, you're even allowed to make it on Shabbos. And finally, here comes the punchline in the Mechaber. Why is this mutter? Shekachu darach refuasai. Because that is the prescription. That's the way chiltis is taken for refuah. Lishtoisai shiva yamim, and the Mishnah Berurah is going to change that to shloisha yamim. Zeh akar zeh. The prescription is you must take it 3 days in a row. Hilkach, therefore, mutter l'shroisai b'tzainen, you're allowed to soak the chiltis in cold water, v'litein b'chama, and then to go warm it up by putting it in the sun, b'pnei shehu sakana im lo yishta mimenu, because it's a sakana if you don't take it. So you're allowed to take it, and if you don't have it prepared, you're even allowed to go ahead and prepare it, if you already took it on Thursday and Friday, so that now it would be a sakana if you don't take it. Says the Mishnah Berurah. Ois cotton ayin beis. The Mechaber said, if you already had the chiltis soaked from Erev Shabbos, then the Mechaber's words were mutter l'shroisai, which would mean it's mutter to soak it. Says the Mishnah Berurah, l'shroisai tzarich leimer l'shtoisai. That's a toyas. It should say l'shtoisai, it's mutter to drink it. V'atam, why is it mutter to drink it? Tizeu Michael k'tzas briim, v'loi minker milsa shehu l'refuah. Oh, I forgot this. The Mishnah Berurah is saying the reason why it's mutter to take the chiltis on Shabbos, if you had it prepared from before Shabbos, we don't need to come on to the heter of sakana for that. Because the drink of chiltis, to drink chiltis, it is not so klar, it's not minker milsa. When people see you drinking chiltis, it's not, oh, that's a refuah. What this reminds me of is the old Luden's cough drops. Luden's cough drops were, when we were kids, the Luden's cough drops, my father bought it for us as a candy. It said in the box, cough drop. Yeah, it was a candy. So people took it as candy. I don't even know if they still exist. I wonder if they still exist. The little Luden's cherry cough drops. But it wasn't considered a medicine. it was considered a candy. So says the Mishnah Berurah, this chiltis, it wasn't so clear that when somebody took chiltis, he was doing something that was for refuah. There were healthy people who drank chiltis too. So that's why the Mechaber says that if you had the chiltis prepared from before Shabbos, are you allowed to drink the chiltis? Yes, you're allowed to drink the chiltis. Because it's not mikra milsa, that what you're doing is for refuah. But if you live in a place where nobody drinks chiltis, they only do it for refuah, mashbe me'arambam the aser. Then the Mechaber said, what if you took chiltis Thursday, you took chiltis Friday, now the prescription bottle says you must take chiltis on Shabbos. Now, if you have chiltis prepared, gesund heit, go ahead, take it. We're not worried about refuah because we just said it's not milk and milsa, even that it's for refuah. But the problem is you don't have chiltis prepared. Now the Mechaber's matir, you can even make the chiltis on Shabbos. You can even soak the chiltis and make the chiltis. Why? Why is this mutter? Because the prescription is, and the words of the Mechaber were that you must take it Shivas Yamim. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Kedisa b'Gemara. The Gemara Kuf Ben Mamad Aleph says that the prescription of chiltis is 3 days in a row. So if you don't take it 3 days in a row, it's sakana. So now making the chiltis is only aser gzerim mishum shchika samamanim. That's an issa d'Rabbanan. Issa d'Rabbanan. It's a makom sakana. Zicha, you're allowed to make it. And then you have to take it warm, so ayin hay, you warm it up a chama, you warm it up in the sun, v'yilek a chama, if there's no sun to warm it up with, afilu ba'ur, you can even warm it up by the fire, shari mipnei ha sakana, because not to do so would pashut be a sakana. Okay, we're going to stop over here. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The source of limud HaTorah should be Megan on Gans Klal Yisrael. The Rosh Hashanah should send Yeshua's refuahs, parnas, and shidduchim to all those in need. We should be zeicha to see the Bias Koil Tzedek B'mher V'Yameinu Amen. Before I say be well, I'll just say that this shir that I just recorded is really the shir for Tisha B'Av. So people, I guess, aren't going to be able to listen to it until Motzei Tisha B'Av, unless Mashiach comes now. Halavai, the Mashiach should come now. Eliyahu Navi cannot come on Erev Shabbos, the Gemara says. So how's Mashiach going to come if Eliyahu Navi can't come? That's the Rosh Hashanah's problem, not my problem. It doesn't say that there are exceptions. So we don't know. Maybe Eliyahu Navi came. We don't know what Eliyahu Navi coming means. What's going to happen when Eliyahu Navi comes? He's going to send out a WhatsApp blast to everybody and say, I'm here. So we don't even know what it means exactly. Maybe he came already. I don't know. So Mashiach could come now. Mashiach could come. So halavai, there shouldn't be a Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av, now it should be canceled. It should be a Moyed. It should be a Yom Tov. And we should all be zeicha to listen to this shir and to learn Torah in Eretz Yisrael. Im Mashiach Tzidkenu. Be well.